just can't live without you. I don't know what to do, I just can't live without you. I don't know what to do, I just can't live without you. I don't know what to do, I just can't live without you. Listen to me, you've got me hooked, you got me bound. I can't stand it when you're not around. I shake and shiver when you're out of sight. When you're near, I gotta hold on tight. I don't know what to do, oh no, I just can't live without you. I know, I don't know what to do, yeah. I just can't live without you. Hey, you build me up when I feel down. I'm gonna spread the word all over town. Only you can turn me on. I gotta have you from dusk till dawn. I don't know what to do, oh yeah. I just can't live without you. Can't live without you. I don't know what to do, oh no. I just can't live without you. Like roses need rain, I need you to ease the pain. When I'm feeling blue, you see me through. There's no one like you. I don't know what to do, oh no. I just can't live without you. No, I don't know what to do, I just can't live without you. When I'm with you, I feel I'm in heaven. You on my mind 24/7. You're the spark that ignites my flame. I've got to have you again and again. I don't know what to do, I just can't live without you. No. I don't know what to do, I just can't live without you. Yeah. I don't know what to do, yeah. I just can't live without you. Can't do without you, yeah. I don't know what to do, I just can't live without you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to thank you all for coming. This is a pre-recorded presentation. This is for my US audience or anyone who is familiar with the underworld history of the United States and not so much of that of the United Kingdom. Now, the story I will be covering will be predominantly in the 1980s, but will slightly move on into the future. Now, this pre-recording has been drawn up for you to be able to draw parallels of the timeline that I will be covering and what was happening in London as well. So the United States. Okay. So during the 1980s, off to the Windy City, Chicago. So during this time, the outfit, Tony Ocado, whilst he still was the main figure, he took more of a backseat during this period, during the 1980s. And during the first half of the 80s, it was run by Joey Doves Iupa, who was in control of this period up until his conviction into the mid-1980s. And then on from there, it was Joe Ferrola, who then was in charge of the outfit during the rest of that decade. Okay, then moving over to City on the Hill. Raymond Patriarca Jr. He took over the reins from his father in the early 80s, and he was allegedly running things after his father's passing. Then over to the Big Apple. Okay, the Colombo family, allegedly run by Carmine Persico during this period. The Lucchese crime family, which was headed up by Vicar Musso, who is currently incarcerated today. Then during this time period, we had the Bonanno family, which was headed up by Phil Rusty Rastelli. Then the one that is globally renowned is John Gotti, who during this time period was the alleged head of the Gambino crime family. And last but not least, the West Side, the Genovese crime family, who at this time was allegedly headed up by Vincent the Chin Gigante. And more also as well, for a lot of the audience, the city of brotherly love, Nicodemo Scarfo, little Nicky, who at this period in time was the alleged head of the Philadelphia crime family. So to get us giving you an idea of what we'll be covering, now on to London. This is going to be more related to what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to touch on a few characters. So starting will be the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate, also known as the Adams Family or the A-Team. Okay, this criminal organisation was founded out of the London Borough of Islington in North London, and a large criminal empire that was allegedly headed up by Terry Adams, along with his brother Patrick Patsy Adams and Sean Tommy Adams. Okay, now the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate, this gang was allegedly heavily involved in drug trafficking and extortion, as well as the hijacking of gold bullion and shipments, as well as security fraud. Okay, now we have as well the Hunt Crime Syndicate. Okay, the Hunt Crime Syndicate is a criminal network that was founded out of Canning Town in East London and was headed up allegedly by David Hunt, aka the Longfella, who was linked or suspectedly linked to violence, fraud, prostitution, money laundering, and murder. Then we have a gang out southeast London, the Arif gang, headed up by aka Bakir Arif, aka the Duke. The Arif gang itself, okay, was to say based out of southeast London. They were a Turkish Cypriot criminal organisation heavily involved in armed robbery, drug trafficking, and other racketeering related activities within the London Underworld since the 1960s. And they, along with his brothers Mehmet and Dennis, as well as Dogan, they ran their criminal empire out southeast London. Now, also as well, we have Kenneth Noy, who's a career criminal. He's been convicted for handling stolen gold from the heist, and he was also convicted of murder, and is well renowned throughout the underworld of London. And then in the story, we have Brian Robinson and Mick McAvoy, who were two robbers that they were convicted and sentenced to 25 years for their main roles in the Brinks-Mat gold bullion robbery. So, as I said before, I'm going to be touching on this. I want to also just go through a few phrases and terms which my US audience, some may know, but some may not, just so that you get an understanding of what I'm talking about. So first off, we have the terminology grass. A grass is someone who is a police informant, someone who testifies and works as a confidential informant as well. As you very well know, the term used in the United States you refer to is a rat. So a rat and a grass is the same thing. Another terminology I will use, you will hear me say, is to go across the pavement. Now that was used in the UK in the underworld, referring to armed robbery, generally the robbing of securical vans, to go across the pavement. A pavement in the UK is your equivalent to the sidewalk. Now, also, we have a terminology for a blagger or blackguard. Now, that's someone who gets their way, gets their own way, the way that they want, in a clever way by saying things that are not true. Okay, so a blagger. Also, as well, another term that you probably will be familiar with is a fence. Someone who spends money to make money through criminal means, and this could be, giving an example, a fence could be someone who finances a job. Let's say a robbery. They'll put up money for weapons, tools, vans, disguises, whatever, but they will do that. They'll probably help plan the job, and they will obviously get a share of the criminal proceeds if a job was pulled off. So this topic that I will be covering, all the information I'm putting out is in the public domain, and most of it is going to be covered in a book that I will be covering, which I will be shouting out at the end of this topic. Now, while some of this information is true, I have to stress this, it can never be verified as 100% accurate. And the information is for educational, entertainment, and satire purposes. And the story will be more than one episode, And this recording will be played at the beginning of each episode, and it will be interactive as well. So I do welcome any of your questions. So what I will say is this: I want to thank you all for tuning in, and please enjoy the live. Hello there, everyone. Well, welcome. Good to see you all. I appreciate it's a Saturday night, and a lot of you have got, as I say, social lives and so forth, depending obviously where you are in the world. But I'm going to get cracking. What I'm going to do, as always, I'd like to greet everyone in the chat and say thank you. As I say, I've got thank you to Edwin and Paul, Joe Bananas. Also, as well, we've got a new recruit, Mr. Balding. And also Tommy 2274. Thank you all for coming. And Mr. Tommy Stiggs, it's always a pleasure to see you. And Tinu, thank you all. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to literally get cracking because I've got a lot of information to get through. I will stop at parts to take any questions. And also as well, not to forget, General Krumel. Thank you, sir, for joining me. Right, everybody. As I say, I will stop and take questions, but I want to get through the information that I have in front of me. So what I want to do as well is just do a quick recap, because for some of you that were in the first part of the live. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just quickly going to share my screen, okay, and just go a quick recap on the story and what we covered in the first part. So as you know, that I mentioned at the beginning obviously the news bulletin that came out on that day in 1983 of the heist. Also as well, we went through the history of London and obviously how these characters, their backgrounds and how they all started to build, and how the underworld started to form from the post-war to the 1970s. So obviously, the characters we've touched on so far the main character has been Mick McAvoy. Also Brian Robinson and Ken Noy and Tony White. The story so far has been based around these characters, as you can see on my screen. Okay, so now I'm going to go onto Avatar. So we're going to rejoin the story. Okay, so right. So as I say, by the time that these gentlemen were in their late teens, muscular hoods like Mick McAvoy and Tony White looked a lot older than their age. They had long since infiltrated the legendary clubs and bars in and around the Old Kent Road in the heart of southeast London, and now they were constantly on the lookout for work. It was no surprise that as their inner circle of acquaintances grew, so did their criminal activities. Crime was an endemic. It was part of the fabric of the society they came from. Southeast London had always been a law unto itself. Why should these things change? Just because a lot of the families had moved out to the suburbs. Now, it was a little wonder this time. By time, the area had developed into London's knowledge epicenter of armed robbery, especially since these youths often stayed at home with their families because they didn't want to end up in crummy bedsits. They'd wait and buy their first property once they had stolen themselves enough cash. Now, the criminal influence could be traced back to the subculture in many ways, and it still exists to this day. So you've had the Great Train Robbery of 1963. Now, this played a part in the process because most of the robbers came from southeast London, and the heroic status of those criminals achieved in the eyes of many was nowhere more evident than on the streets where the young hoods like McAvoy and White grew up. Now, armed robbery had taken on a romantic hue all of its own, and by the early 70s, it was positively glamorous. People still saw those villains as budding Robin Hoods striking blows against the traditional enemy. Now, the police, the filth, the cozzers, as the police were renowned as, all the other derogatory names they were called. Criminals were celebrated and talked about in youth clubs and pubs because they were seen to be getting one back on the establishment. Now, when in 1978, an armed police officer shot 2 gun-touting robbers dead in Peckham, southeast London, and wounded a third, and they tried to snatch £50,000 from a security van. Extra police had to be drafted into the area to prevent a riot. Women shouted abuse at the police officers from the balconies of their flats. Children taunted them in the street, and 7 people at a pub frequented by the robbers were arrested on charges ranging from the threatening behaviour to assault. Southeast London pubs like the Frog and Nightgown and the Connoisseur, the Prince of Wales and the Beehive in Beckham all became notorious haunts for young hoods like McAvoy and White, and a number of pubs were places where guns could be obtained almost over the counter. Many of those very same taverns were now considered virtually no-go areas by the police. Now, back in those early days, only a brave and foolish man would try and muscle in on the legendary criminals such as the South East London's most feared family, the Richardsons, who were treated like royalty south of the Thames during the 60s. The Richardsons ran a hugely profitable empire, stretching from South London scrapyards and West End drinking clubs to gold mines in South Africa. Their leader, Charlie Richardson, was known as the hardest man in South London. Even the crazy were wary about venturing onto his turf. But when in the late 1960s, Richardson was eventually brought to court and found guilty of fraud, extortion, assault and grievously bodily harm, a trial during which the judge called him a disgrace to society. Some of the up-and-coming and younger hoods noticed gaps appearing inside the South East London Underworld. As one senior flying squad officer from that era explained, the whole place opened up. People with strong personalities decided to move in. As these new faces began feeling their way through what had once been considered Richardson territory, all sorts of new criminal enterprises began springing up. Billy Hayward, one of the most feared gangsters in South East London, had already secured a place in gangland folklore by engaging in a nightclub battle with the Richardson gang over who should control the protection rackets. One of Hayward's men, Dickie Hart, was shot dead in the 1966 clash, which became known as the Battle of the Mr. Smith's Club. This event effectively led to the gradual destruction of the Richardsons' criminal empire, since it prompted the public outcry about gangsters on the streets of London, something the Metropolitan Police were forced to crack down on heavily. Now, despite the extra police pressure, Mr. Smith turned Billy Hayward into an underworld legend. Hayward encouraged inspiring villains like McAvoy and White and Robinson and others to commit criminals on behalf of himself and other older criminals who would then invest the stolen goods and money in small businesses such as minicab companies, laundrettes, and sometimes even the stock market. Now, inevitably, the police began taking a closer look at these emerging villains. Many younger criminals reacted by running feuds with certain local cozzers who were forever trying to arrest them for a variety of petty offences. In some cases, the police got so desperate to lock them up, they would resort to illicit fit-ups to ensure that some of these faces were off the street. Sounds familiar? Now, the old school villains warned the up-and-coming youngsters that they needed to keep certain policemen on their side. Eventually, they started winning over a few friendly coppers by tipping them off on certain stolen shipments they heard about. So they'd then be left on their own devices on other bigger jobs. It was a classic case of back scratching, but Mick McAvoy was no grass and swore he would never play that game. Nevertheless, characters like Mick McAvoy, Brian Robinson and Tony White had encountered enough big names by this stage to know if they were going to infiltrate the upper echelons of the South East London underworld, they'd have to share warm pints of bitter with some hard characters. As legendary former Craze associate Freddie Foreman later explained, you'll meet a certain person and you'll get a rapport with them. You will like them, and the best way to know that they're okay is through the belly of a man. You get drunk with them, you have one night out, and then you see the way they perform and handle themselves. If he doesn't get soppy and start running off his mouth and getting salty to women, and he can conduct himself with or without a drink, then you know he's a good guy. Now, once you formed a relationship with another criminal, he would have your unquestioned loyalty. You got involved with them because they were in a twisted way completely trustworthy. You knew that they wouldn't turn you over, and you had their trust, and they had yours. These were the kind of values that appealed to people like Mickey McAvoy. Now, it's now clear that the control of what the popular newspapers like to call London's Underworld switched to a new kind of villain in the late 1960s. The older Underworld heroes emerged immediately after the Second World War and were larger-than-life characters than that of the Fleet Street crime reporters, dubbed which names such as King of the Underworld and the King of the Dog Dopers, but eventually so-called big names were replaced by professional robbers, organised in carefully selected teams constantly on the lookout for lucrative targets. These characters didn't run clubs in Soho and protection rackets or pimp women. They were real pros and saw the less glamorous but more lucrative robbing of banks and security vans as their chosen career. Crime in the late 60s was heading for epidemic proportions, especially in London. Tens of millions of pounds worth of stolen property changed hands every week. Now, violent offences were up by more than 10% from each year from 1965, and the number of drug convictions was slowly beginning to rise. Although it was not yet profitable business, it would eventually become. Many believe that jailing of London's two most notorious criminal families, the Crays and the Richardsons, in the late 60s would destroy the menace of the organised crime. They couldn't have been more wrong. New, better organised crime networks quickly emerged and were often run by outsiders rather than blood relatives. They were prepared to finance everything from bank robberies to drug deals. Hijacked good lorries were another particular popular source of income at the time, with the driver usually being bunged a few bob in advance to ensure a successful raid. Now, it seemed as if no amount of the police activity could stem the tide of crime that was sweeping the nation at this time. The older crime boss had been happy to hide behind the hardcore do-or-die young villains for too long. Now these so-called kids were vowing to run their own operations without any interference from the old boys. Now these characters resented all authority, even in the shape of the older, supposedly wiser villains. Mickey McAvoy and many of his contemporaries effortlessly crossed the line from being cheeky Charlies into cold-blooded, out-and-out criminals, prepared to end a man's life if they had to. Now, they had long since lost touch with the law-abiding world and so-called normal behaviour, choosing a life of crime for which nothing was going to deter them. They were also another side to the criminals like McAvoy that made them virtually fearless. They were not afraid to go to prison. In fact, they accepted that it would happen soon or later, and if they did, they'd take their bird, which is their sentence, and they'd deal with it. After all, it was part and parcel of their chosen profession. Now, the late 60s was a time of great unrest in prisons across Britain. In Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight, a huge riot erupted after inmates began protesting about conditions. For 40 terrifying minutes on the 24th of October in 1969, 7 members of staff were in fear of their lives as riot-crazed inmates held them captive. One prisoner came within a whisker of slitting the throat of an officer. 9 prisoners, including some of the legendary South East London faces, eventually surrendered. Accounts of their daring behaviour spread like wildfire through the pubs and drinking clubs of south of the Thames. Villains believed the authorities were trying to break their spirit and stop them planning new crimes with other inmates whenever they were banged up. Most criminals' other main preoccupation inside prison was keep fit. They exercised ferociously, narcissistically, pumping up their already vast physiques and punishing regimes that many of them would maintain for the rest of their lives. Every time they did a press up, they saw it as a mark of defiance against the system. They'd never be beaten, ever. Now, by the time the early 1970s hit South East London, it was also filled with sharp-eyed detectives determined to win back the streets after all those gangsters filled the years of the 60s. Dominated by the Crays, the Richardsons, in 1973, Scotland Yard's Chief Detective, Superintendent Albert Wickstead, aka the Grey Fox, head of the Yard's Serious Crime Squad, sanctioned raid after raid, which resulted in 230 officers taking 93 men and 1 woman into custody. One senior detective told the Daily Express at the time, "The other side have never been hit so hard." The operation had been carried out by Scotland Yard's much feared flying squad, based at Limehouse Police Station in the middle of the East End. They were single-mindedly trying to take on the South London robbers, and it would lead to a cat and mouse games, and that would last for at least 2 decades and be peppered with accusations ranging from bribery to the alleged participation of certain officers in actual robberies. Now, the flying squad had been in existence for so long that the squad's nickname in rhyming slang, the Sweeney. Okay, now that's from the flying squad, Sweeney Todd, the notorious Fleet Street barber who turned his customers into meat pies. This was already regarded as a cliche. Now, the squad was set up at the end of the First World War, when London experienced a crime wave as large numbers of men were recently released from the armed forces emerged onto the streets of the capital, many of them hardened to violence after the carnage on the Western Front. The Sweeney enjoyed rapid crime busting, and in 1920 was provided with 2 motor tenders capable of a top speed of 35 miles per hour. Now, the Daily Mail journalists referred to them as a flying squad, a flying squad of picked detectives, and the name stuck. Their exploits went on to figure in a number of British films, and in the mid-70s, the squad would be immortalised in the TV series The Sweeney. Now, but the glamorous, hard-nosed image of the flying squad left the detectives wide open to accusations of corruption, even through turning a blind eye on what was going on in return for a cut of the action. If the information led to the recovery of stolen property, pocketed some of the reward money that the detective claimed on the informant's behalf. Now, a strategically placed officer could also, for a fee, ensure bail was granted, hold back evidence and details about past convictions from a court, or pass on to a person under investigation details of a case being made against him, or warnings about the police operations in which he could become compromised. Now, in the mid-1970s, villains like McAvoy, Robinson and White were making their names for themselves. The newly appointed Deputy Assistant Commissioner, David Powis, ordered a crackdown to stop corrupt policemen from creaming off reward money meant for informants. He insisted on meeting all the informants as part of a vetting process that in the future all payments amounting to more than £500 will be handed over by the DAC himself. Now, the flying squad itself had already come under close scrutiny in November 1971. The Sunday People revealed that the commander, Kenneth Drury, and the head of the flying squad had been on holiday in Cyprus, where the infamous Soho pornographer, a man with 9 convictions to his name, including a spell in Dartmoor prison, had been his host. Now, Drury was served with disciplinary papers and suspended. He immediately resigned after them face a full disciplinary hearing. But before doing so, he wrote an article for the News of the World claiming that a criminal called Jimmy Humphreys had been one of his informants. The furious pornographer, aware of the effect of such a claim could have on his many contacts, responded a week later through the columns of the same paper, saying he could never have received any money from Drury and in fact wined and dined the police chief on a total of 58 occasions, during which Humphreys always picked up the bill. At his eventual trial, Flying Squad Chief Drury said it was absolute essential for Flying Squad officers to mix socially with people connected with criminal fraternity. Now, Drury claims during his career that he made a point of mixing with criminals, and it was essential to do so. And that you cannot expect them to give information about crimes if you ostracize them, except when you want information from them. The problem with the Drury philosophy was that it left detectives wide open to accusations of corruption. Now, Drury himself was convicted on 5 counts of corruption, and jailed for 8 years. Not surprisingly, the flying squad was completely overhauled. Instead of dealing with serious crimes in general, they would in future tackle armed robberies only, with the squad's officers forming a central robbery squad from the coordinating unit at Scotland Yard and four smaller groups strategically placed around London. Now the message was loud and clear to the blaggers: we are out to get you. But the biggest problem, as far as the villains were concerned, were the so-called supergrasses, who become the key to police success. These characters were a cut above the usual grass and snouts, who helped the police with their inquiries in exchange for a free pint or a fiver. The stakes were much higher and often meant immunity from prosecution in exchange for the inside track of major robberies. It was a breakthrough for the police. Inevitably, it came at a cost. Hard-hitting detectives from the flying squad were actively persuading some members of close-knit gangs to inform on robberies in advance. Perhaps the most notorious of all the supergrasses was the controversial chip to freedom, the bank robber, Bertie Smalls. Bertie Smalls negotiated from Britain's lawkeepers. Characters like Smalls played their cards close to their chest. His chips were times, places like halls and Christian names. Smalls and other grasses believed that they had to offer what would be enough to win most important gamble of their lives: freedom. Smalls became one of the most hated men in London Underworld, and as a result, joining the other side, many villains shared the opinion of one of their own number who said he'd gladly kill the bastard for nothing. He's vermin, and he should be wiped off the face of this earth. Now, in May 1974, Small helped convict 7 men at the Old Bailey of robbing Barclays Bank in Ilford of £237,736, which is obviously quite a lot back then, and Barclays Wembley branch of £138,111. After that, he was guarded by 12 armed detectives at a secret hideout 24 hours a day, knowing full well that a £60,000 contract had been put on his head. Now, back in South East London, Mick McAvoy and others were outraged. This ain't about money. It's about respect and not grassing up people. It's the ultimate sin, ain't it? He told one associate. Now, the flying squad regularly hauled him up and coming young villains like McAvoy, suspecting they were connected to particular crimes, but with no way of actually proving it. McAvoy and some of his contemporaries were often approached by crime bosses to help frame high-ranking police officers just before the police were due to give evidence in major trials. Now, the aim was to smear their names to such an extent that the evidence would be seriously questioned in court. But McAvoy didn't fancy that sort of work. He still preferred robberies to framing the filth. He knew that was asking for trouble. McAvoy had big plans to turn himself into a major league criminal, carrying out one of the biggest, most lucrative robberies. He already had a reputation to maintain, and he certainly wasn't prepared to start grassing up the villains to the causes. But some of his criminal contemporaries had other ideas. They believed that swapping certain information with the enemy might actually give them more space to develop their own criminal enterprises. And in the middle of this virtual war between the cops and robbers, security van holdups and bank robberies were getting a lot harder to pull off. Guards equipped with batons and truncheons were now being used much more regularly to escort large quantities of cash, which meant the robbers were going to have to step up levels of threats and maybe resort to more frequently to violence if they were to continue robbing with abandon on the streets of London. Right, I'm going to just stop there. I just want to greet everyone in the chat that I haven't greeted yet. Hello there, Stu. Thank you for coming. Stu D. Good to see you. Hello there, Mickey Griggs. Thank you. Janie, it's a pleasure to see you. Todd Father. Excellent. Good to see you all. Who else is there? Joe Delamora. Good to see you. Yeah. Just taking a pause out. I hope, as I say, you've been able to get that information. Okay. Just want to take a pause. All right. I'm now going to move on to the next chapter. Now, the 70s saw the ethnic makeup of the old London criminal manners completely transformed by the arrival of hundreds of thousands of immigrants, particularly from Asia. Now, Mickey McAvoy didn't really like what he saw. He believed in the good old-fashioned ethos that England was for the English, conveniently forgetting that his family were originally from Ireland. Now, the Mr. Patels running the corner shops, stores in his home manor of Camberwell, and the West Indian bus conductors were a source of constant irritation to McAvoy and his mates. Overt racism was rife, and there were few who would refrain from openly slagging off other races. There had also been other even bigger changes afoot in the South and East London. Much of the capital was gradually being gentrified. Some areas were being colonised by office blocks. The old faces were really had faded away. The Crays and the Richardsons had been inside prison for a while, and many of the old associates had fled to Spain's Costa del Sol, safe in the knowledge that they couldn't be extradited back to the UK. The shadowy, secretive figures who had been taken over the underworld were not interested in flashy cars or hobnobbing with the rich and famous. They were ambitious, greedy, and extremely cold-blooded, and they believed that keeping a low profile would guarantee them a much longer reign in the underworld than the loudmouth criminal families of old. Many of these deadly characters were even building property empires on a bed of black money by financing major crimes and then pouring their cash into major London building developments. These would eventually include the Docklands area near Wapping, later to be turned into the financial centre of the capital. By this time, McAvoy and his mates Brian and Tony had pulled together a classy team of robbers, more than capable of stealing from the supposedly robber-proof security vans that were being built to withstand the armed raiders. Now, these vehicles were factory tested with pickaxes and cutters. Even shots were fired at them. The idea was to turn the vans into a fortress on wheels, completely with a supposedly sophisticated alarm system. A whole industry had developed around finding the means to stop robbers getting their hands on the money while it was on the move. Security firms even copied the military by having their staff wear uniforms. So it was no surprise by the mid-70s, blaggers began shooting at guards more frequently. Most villains would swear blind that they never intended to injure anyone, but simply used the fear factor of firing a gun to scare their victims into surrendering their money. However, the police, especially the flying squad, saw this as the villains openly stepping up the war on the streets of London. They became obsessed with catching the robbers, preying on security vans, which meant they spent much of their days and their time chasing their tails. On payday, which at this time was on Thursdays, many flying squad detectives were simply sent onto the streets of London to look out for the robbers. The reality was that the police simply weren't prepared or equipped for the latest surge in the crime of robbery. It was a perfect time for young robbers like McAvoy and his associates to thrive. Now, the police were stretched at the best of times and always relied on solving crimes after they were committed rather than preventing them. It was an uphill struggle that would inevitably lead to closer relationship with criminals and the police, something which itself would lead to even bigger problems later with the police corruption and bribery. Okay, hello there, Janie. Hello there, Marta. Joe Delamora. Excellent, good to see you. Now, in the summer of 1976, McAvoy, Tony White and Brian Robinson met up with a couple of well-respected older armed robbers in a pub in southeast London. That's when Mickey hit the big time, explained one old South London face. It was all about the man who knows a man who knows a man. The three hard men were asked outright if they were interested in being part of a team of robbers looking to expand beyond London and hit lucrative southeast England market. It sounded like a sales job rather than a recruitment pitch for a gang of armed blaggers. Now, McAvoy, Robinson and White saw this as a definite step up the criminal ladder. Now, the two older financiers in the pub were offering to back McAvoy and his associates with the cash in exchange for a percentage of the takings from every robbery. Now, the gang's total haul would eventually exceed 2 million, making them at the time one of the most successful teams of robbers ever seen in the UK. The robbers were soon operating nationwide from London to Essex, across the Midlands, and as far as Dundee in Scotland. McAvoy wasn't the brains behind the gang, but he was a highly influential team member. In fact, there was no overall Mr. Big in charge as such, because a hardcore committee of criminal faces financed and selected the jobs to be done, checked details and laid out security plans, and then suggested the right men for the job. Now, Brian Robinson, who was older than McAvoy and White, eventually became the self-proclaimed colonel, the man who'd pull each job together. Robinson was well built, with a round, deadpan face, and gave little away. He'd served in the army before returning to the mean streets of South London. Now, the former painter and decorator was so proficient at organisation that the police later said he'd become a millionaire businessman if he used his talents more honestly. One detective recalled, Brian was a modest, unpretentious fellow who kept a really low profile. There was no flash car or flash house. God knows what he did with his money, but we never found any of it. Other robbers came in and out of the gang as it sparked terror and stole fortunes up and down the country. But McAvoy, Robinson and White were at the core of most raids. McAvoy and the other two often suggested new targets they'd seen on their travels. Now, the team eventually had one golden rule: try to pick the most isolated spot for the actual robbery, whether it was a moving target, a van or a factory. The quieter the better, because then we knew the causes would take a lot longer getting there, one team member later explained. Fast and efficient gateway vehicles were a vital tool for any big robbery. The gang would go on to steal literally hundreds of them during their reign. A well-stocked arsenal of weapons was also essential. There was a jester-like range of disguises, including ginger wigs, coloured spectacles, false beards and large moustaches. Some robbers were even prepared to dress up as women to confuse potential witnesses. Now, McAvoy and the gang's other strong arm were expected not to hesitate to fire weapons, usually revolvers and shotguns. Although the intention was to warn people off rather than to actually do them harm, they were using sledgehammers and iron bars to shatter windscreens. The gang's weapons were initially obtained by breaking into gun shops, but there were a number of shady criminal gun dealers emerging in the underworld at this time, including one notorious character who, even though he had once been a policeman, would eventually become their favourite, the Merchant of Death. Now, the gang often relied on bent security guards who tipped them the nod when a van was carrying a particularly large amount of money. If security guards didn't respond well to approaches from the gang, then sometimes one of them would pay a little visit to the guard's family as a friendly reminder they were not to be crossed. Meanwhile, the flying squad's message to the robbers of South London was clear: you'll be shot dead if you carry arms. To some criminals at that time, the police had become the judge, jury and executioner, all rolled into one. But all it really was stiffening their resolve to beat the police by whatever means. So in the late 1970s, a number of South East London professional villains known as McAvoy and Robinson, they joined a Freemasons lodge in West London, following an introduction from a well-known Kent criminal who had big connections inside the Freemasons. According to one police source inside the shadowy organisation, one villain's membership was actually proposed and seconded by a serving police officer. Now, the Masons Lodge, they joined, including members who were police and dealers in gold bullion and other precious metals. Now, the criminals saw it was a perfect opportunity to ease their way into the group of new contacts. They began soothing their passage in by making some substantial donations to several charities. Now, members of the Freemasons Lodge was a natural step for any ambitious South East London criminal keen to infiltrate the circle of acquaintances that crossed all social divides and included several judges and magistrates. Now, the Freemasons are a controversial society, not least because of the vast number of policemen who are members. Though many look upon the Masons as a mysterious and secretive organisation, others claim that they are nothing more than a very discreet gentleman's club with tens of thousands of members across Britain. How much power and influence they wielded amongst this country's politicians and lawmakers will probably never be known. But there was absolute no doubt that it was the presence of senior policemen in the Masons that fueled the villains' interest in joining. As one police officer later explained, these criminals cynically manoeuvred themselves into the Masons as if it was the right pub for them to be seen at. Some police officer members of the West London Lodge were outraged by the presence of known criminals in their ranks, but others saw it as an ideal opportunity to pick new informants. McAvoy and others encouraged the criminal associates to be Masons because they saw membership as further evidence of their status within the London Underworld. So you can see there, you may be aware of the Masons. It was a secret society, and it was sort of mainly made up of, the upper social classes. So you had police officers, detectives, judges, but the criminals wanted to work their way in because obviously they saw it as their opportunity to get the police on side. They could obviously get tip-offs, but yeah, the police saw it from their perspective that they could flip them and make them become informants. So it could have had more practical benefits. On a number of occasions, criminals wriggled out of an arrest for handling stolen goods thanks to the membership of the Masons. One police source recalled the day that he arrested one notorious South East London villain who later played a big role in laundering the Brinks-Mat gold. "He's on the square," a Mason detective told the arresting officer at Kent Police Station. "So? Can't you help out? Where are you coming from on this?" "Oh, it's like that, is it? Too bloody right it is." A number of Freemason police officers began happily lying and vouching for the villains who were members because they generally believed that it's to a certain degree membership put these characters above the law. And of course, all villains in the Masons swiftly mastered the art of the Freemason handshake. This involved putting the thumb between the first finger and the second finger and pressing the knuckle on the middle of the finger, which would indicate that the person in question was on the third degree. Mason speaking for being a member, that was. Now, whenever these criminals met a policeman they thought was a Mason, they'd make a point of speaking to him very carefully to ascertain his membership. The conversation would have bizarre overtones. You ever been taught to be cautious? Yeah. Well, my mother always taught me to look left and right before I crossed the road. If the person they were speaking to said yes, then they would be followed up with passwords. Are you a regular attender? Yeah. The moment someone said that back, they knew they'd connect with a fellow Mason. Okay. Right. There's Paul's in there. Just going to have a quick look in the chat. Paul, good to see you. Team Do It Is. It was a cool club back then. As I say, you've got special perks of being in certain organisations like that. Okay. Right. Mick McAvoy, Brian Robinson and Tony White, not to mention dozens of other South East London blaggers, clearly considered themselves highly professional criminals. Robberies on banks and armour vehicles and vans carrying wages were still booming during the late 70s. And despite the latest technology, which was supposed to make it harder for the villains to strike, the criminals even started using new secret weapons all of their own. Take the Argon arc gun, a high-powered electric torch that could cut its way through metal. The guns weren't available in shops and could only be ordered, which should have made it easier for the police to trace them back to their owners. But McAvoy and his associates eventually found a factory in West London that stored the Argon guns, and they broke in and stole 6 of them. Now, one typical job was the audacious 1977 hijacking of an armoured van on the streets of Croydon. After inside information was provided to the gang, making them aware that at least £100,000 in cash was up for grabs. The gang pulled in front of the armoured van before turning around to ram it in head on. The terrified guards flung open the doors and were immediately hauled out of the van and coshed by the group of masked men. Although one of the gang later insisted they were only glancing blows designed to mark but not injure them. Now, one robber jumped in the back of the van and ripped open the wages compartment before the blaggers formed a chain and began slinging boxes from hand to hand into the boot of their getaway car. So within a few minutes, they'd quit the scene and swapped their first car for another 1.5 mile away. It was the sort of job that got the South London Underworld sitting up and taking notice of McAvoy, Robinson and their brash young band of robbers. Now, there were at least 2 or 3 substantial robberies every week in London and the South East England at this time. One of the most legendary was a classic blagging in the Blackwall Tunnel on the 29th of September 1977. Now, it caught the eye of just about every South London villain at the time. This particular job was a huge boost to the legendary South East London hard man called Jimmy Moody, who even went as far as to dress as a policeman to hold back the traffic, which brought this reaction from a lawyer who later defended him in court. Those were the days when an awful lot of policemen came from the same background as the villains they were chasing. It was hard to tell the flying squad guy that an armed robber apart, and Jimmy was a very plausible copper. There were even rumours a detective had been provided the police uniforms for the job. Other officers were later said to have been given payoffs from the takings of the Blackwall Tunnel job to ensure the robbers weren't apprehended. Now, in the Blackwall Tunnel raid, PC Moody created a gap in the traffic and forced the security van to stop just past the bend, about 2/3 of the way into the tunnel. At the same time, 2 of the robbers stayed to crash behind them to block the tunnel just before the bend. Now, the gang used 3 stolen cars and a stolen van to surround the security wagon. The team had done their homework because once inside the tunnel, the security van's radio was useless. PC Moody then leapt out of his car, confiscated the keys, and several motorists behind them in the tunnel at gunpoint said they couldn't drive off and raise the alarm. Now, in the pubs and clubs of South East London, the Blackwall Tunnel hijack went down as a brilliantly executed job. It helped popularise a new 4-letter word which summed it all up: the buzz. As Moody's co-robber, Bernie Khan, later explained, the buzz was that on that job was better than any drugs. All the adrenaline pumping through you was fucking incredible. And the feeling of elation once you snatched the cash was out of this world. Now, Moody was eventually arrested for his part in the crime and as well his involvement in other raids. And in 1979, he was sent to remand at Brixton Prison to await trial for the armed robbery. He escaped before the trial was heard, only to be murdered by a hitman while he was on the run. Nevertheless, McAvoy, Robinson, White had great admiration for jobs like the Blackwall Tunnel robbery. All 3 actively sought bigger and more lucrative targets. Groups of heavy-looking men regularly called round for meetings in McAvoy at his house, his family, and they moved into Dulwich in South East London. He told his family the visitors were just part of a betting syndicate. Now, McAvoy's loyalty to his associates was almost as strong as his devotion to his wife and children. When keep fit fanatic McAvoy turned his garden shed into a mini gym, complete with weights, chest expanders, and a punch bag, so he could be in prime condition for the jobs. His wife would only jokingly ask him, "Going for the next Olympics?" "Nah, just keeping fit for my job," would come the response, but it was a different job from the one his family no doubt wished he had. McAvoy's obsession with keeping fit had started in his early teens, thanks to his genuine belief that a healthy body led to a healthy mind and healthy and clear mind. Now, he believed his fitness meant he was much less likely to make any costly mistakes when he was out robbing and thieving. Now, the 2 sides of Mickey McAvoy's character were already clearly defined. If you saw him out with his young wife Kathy and 2 young children on a sunny Sunday afternoon in South East London, you'd never guess he was a ruthless criminal already responsible for many robberies across the capital. Often when he got home after a job, Kathy would be watching the TV news item about a robbery, but if she carefully asked McAvoy about it, his reply would always be the same: good luck to him. There were rules in South London, and one of the most important ones was never to directly admit your crimes to anyone, not even your own wife and family. Wives were often infuriated with their husbands so blatantly ignored their attempts to find out more about their husbands' activities. That's when villains like Mickey McAvoy would usually take a deep breath and reply along the lines of, "Darling, don't worry, I won't let you down. Just don't ask questions." Like so many other London villains before him, McAvoy seemed to thrive on his 2 lives. As one old friend later explained, Mickey was essentially a loner. He rarely got too close to people. It's a funny thing to say, but he was also a very good family man. McAvoy thoroughly enjoyed the security of a stable home to return to after days and nights of partying and thieving. He knew he couldn't survive the real bad world if he didn't have the bit of good in him about the world as well. So Mickey McAvoy managed to be an even-tempered character most of the time, but when he did lose his temper, the sparks would really fly, and that was why he was known as Mad Mickey. To so many criminal associates by this time, McAvoy revelled in his nickname because it was like a warning sign to other criminals not to cross him under any circumstances. Wherever Mickey McAvoy went, there was also a hint of the other side in his expression, said one South London villain. McAvoy had his scowl, which was permanently etched across his face. He already had a lot of enemies, so he never fully switched off. Nonetheless, many South London villains were already impressed by McAvoy. He'd always have money in his pocket, but he wasn't flash. Mickey didn't trust no one, and that's the best way to be in this business. I think the only person he ever trusted was himself. You see, Mickey was already well known, but he wasn't really known by anyone, if you see what I mean. Brian Robinson's reputation was one of those classic villains renowned as a man with a plan. One of his oldest South London friends explained, Brian loved planning stages of any job. He mapped things out very carefully and often came up with something a bit different that would catch people off guard. Robinson was respected by all who came into contact with him. He was a professional villain, but he also, like McAvoy, had a normal home life with a wife and children whom he clearly valued more than anything, apart from his work. One old associate explained, Brian kept things low-key. He was tenacious and hard-working. He saw blagging as his profession, and he was quietly proud of his skills, although he never blew his own trumpet. It was during the early planning stages of yet another new job that McAvoy met a man known as the Fox at a West End nightclub. The Fox, who would eventually play a pivotal role in the life of so many of the Brinks-Mat robbers, had a resonant, gravelly voice with a very slight Cockney accent. He told McAvoy he'd easily be able to find some extra financial backing for any special jobs which might potentially net them a fortune. The Fox had once been a top blagger himself, as well as being a renowned fixer for criminals as far back as the late 1940s. There were even rumours that the Fox had been involved in helping finance the Great Train robbery nearly 20 years earlier. He said he was in close touch with a bunch of big-time villains, all of whom were keen to invest some cash in the right type of job. McAvoy and his older associate, Brian Robinson, knew perfectly well in order to move up the ladder of South East London's villainy, they needed to hit a really big target, one that would cement their criminal infamy and maybe even assure them the sort of riches that might mean an early, happy retirement. Now, McAvoy obsessive quest for cash even led him to get involved in a sideline that many other villains back then would have frowned upon. He was arrested after his brother and another man were found with £250,000 worth of cocaine at Heathrow Airport. McAvoy had allegedly wanted to sell on the cocaine to help finance bigger and more lucrative robberies, or at least that's what he later claimed to associates. A search of various premises by detectives following the Heathrow arrest also uncovered a large number of shotguns and pistols, as well as 2 chainsaws. McAvoy was not just an armed robber, police suspected, but possibly even an underworld armourer as well. McAvoy naturally later claimed he was fitted up by the Cozzers, but whatever the truth of the matter, he'd now marked himself out as a player in the first division of robbers, which meant that he would be given constant attention by his sworn enemy, the Sweeney. By a strange twist of fate, McAvoy's alleged involvement with the drugs haul at Heathrow brought him into contact with a couple of characters who had extensive knowledge of London's premier airport and the industrial estates that surrounded it. McAvoy was told in no uncertain terms that they represented lucrative targets, since many of these warehouses were used to store more valuable goods and flights in and out of Heathrow. Now, McAvoy mentioned this to his old mate Brian Robinson. This information reminded Robinson that his irritating brother-in-law, Tony Black, worked at Brinks-Mat warehouse near Heathrow. Brinks-Mat was one of the best-known security companies in the world at the time, so it was a safe bet that some very interesting cargoes were stored on their premises. Now, Robinson approached Tony Black very casually, and his sister's husband immediately began talking openly about the vast amounts of gold and cash and traveller's checks that were frequently stored in the warehouse overnight between flights in and out of the United States. Now, Robinson knew that Black was hard up because he was gambling. He was a gambling addict, and there was no way his relative's low security guard's salary would cover his debts. That made Black vulnerable, or in the words of one detective, a sitting fucking duck. Now, the Brinks-Mat warehouse looked as if it had the potential to be the biggest target of Robinson and McAvoy's criminal career. So for many weeks, the team used an empty building near the warehouse to allow them to watch the movements of vans in and out of the Brinks-Mat building. They hadn't yet told Black that there were robbery plans, because they didn't want him to know they were serious until it was too late for him to change his mind about being involved in the heist. So the day after the day, McAvoy and his associates built up a second-by-second work schedule for the Brinks-Mat guards as they peered through the windows of the abandoned warehouse. Now, it was crucial to know what the exact movements of the Brinks-Mat staff, so the robbers could work out the point in the day when the warehouse stuffed with cash and gold was most vulnerable. Now, McAvoy Robinson and their other main partner in crime, Tony White, even tried to finance this complex, risky job themselves by carrying out the robbery of a security van, which they believed would be carrying £250,000 in cash. They didn't want to share the spoils from this new big job with people like the Fox and his band of armchair villains. But after the relatively simple hold-up, McAvoy and the gang were bitterly disappointed to discover they only managed to steal about £30,000 in total. Each member of the team was given a few £1,000s to tide him over until the next big job, while the remaining money was kept in reserve to put towards the raid on the Brinks-Mat warehouse. McAvoy, Robinson and his other fellow robbers were just addicted to the buzz of committing robberies as they were underworld heroes from the Chainsaw Gang, who caused havoc by robbing several security vans during the 70s and the early 1980s. They earned their nickname because they used a chainsaw to open up the back of security vans, almost as easy as if they'd used a tin opener on a can of baked beans. They had long since proved beyond doubt they had the bottle to carry out spectacular jobs. Now, the only disappointment was the money, which often fell hundreds of thousands of pounds short of expectation. Nevertheless, their reputation in South London remained intact. It was acknowledged that they had no control over how much money was on offer. It was simply a question of bad luck. McAvoy's underworld associates even seemed to believe the rumour that he only got involved in an early cocaine deal with his brother, because he was planning to use the profits to finance more robberies. But no one on the fringe of the South London underworld knew precisely where or when the big job was going to be carried out. Meanwhile, the police stepped up pressure by knocking on McAvoy's front door in southeast London, inquiring about his movements on the day of certain robberies. McAvoy was so confident they had no evidence that he'd agreed to go down the police station and try and clear up any misunderstandings. A few times he was even asked to appear in identity parades, but he was never once picked out as a serious suspect. McAvoy later recalled that many ID parades were comical. They, meaning the police, were just testing the water, and they'd try and make me wear something different from the others in the lineup, just so they knew I'd more than likely to be picked out. Talk about fucking bent. Hardened South London villains like McAvoy and his gang never made any statements to the police, even though after they were charged. They'd later insist that once a few bob had been thrown in the right direction, they'd usually get bail, despite the serious nature of their alleged crimes. In the middle of all this police harassment, as they like to call it, McAvoy and Robinson were carefully, expertly planning the big job, the raid on the Brinks-Mat warehouse near Heathrow Airport. In the aftermath of any raid that didn't go completely according to plan, McAvoy would become obsessed by the idea that someone inside the gang must have been a police informant, a grass, or a rat. McAvoy told other gang members that if he ever found that one of his team members was a grass, there was only one way to deal with him. I'd have him fucking done. And Mad Mickey meant it. Like so many of his fellow South London villains, he remained convinced informants were Judases who should have been drowned at birth. Hear, hear. Aside from the chance to make money and glory, another reason why McAvoy became so desperate to pull off the big job at the Brinks-Mat warehouse at Heathrow was that he and his criminal associates knew that van hijacks were going across the pavement were going to get too dangerous one day. Drugs looked like the safer option when it came to earning fortunes from crime. Eventually, the time came for Brian Robinson to fully reveal to his brother-in-law, Tony Black, their intention to rob Black's employers at the Brinks-Mat. Black, still desperately in debt, jumped at the chance to help the gang in exchange for a share of the proceeds. The gang had thoroughly established the movements of the Brinks-Mat staff through Black, as well as their careful surveillance operation. Initially, McAvoy found himself hard to believe that such a small, relatively lightly guarded warehouse could have such extraordinary amounts of cash and gold overnight. Back in those days, most robbers still presumed banks were the places really worth raiding. Now the big job looked like a dead cert. However, McAvoy and Robinson had little option but to accept what they needed, some serious financial backing after the disastrously low amount of cash obtained from previous robberies. McAvoy got in contact with the same character he met earlier. Yeah, the Fox, who pledged upfront cash to the gang if they ever went after the really big targets. There would have to be some serious investment of cash in certain items before they would be fully ready to pull off the Brinks-Mat raid. The Fox introduced McAvoy and Robinson to a family of North London criminals called the Adams, known in the underworld as the A-Team. They had been quietly but firmly asserting themselves as the capital's most powerful clan of villains since the Crays and the Richardsons. The Fox insisted the A-Team were London's most proficient money launderers, and as such they would be a vital cog in the team's machinery when it came to dispersing all the cash immediately after the robbery. Now, the A-team were headed up by Terry Adams and his brothers, Tommy Adams and Patrick. They were the three eldest of 11 children who had been brought up in the as Irish Catholics in a North London council flat. They'd first broken through the underworld by using their fists to extort money from market stall holders. This had been followed up by a meteoric rise to power in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, thanks to drug trafficking, extortion, hijacking, security fraud, and large-scale blaggings. So based in Clerkenwell, North London, the Adams family managed to evade prosecution for years by running their syndicate at arm's length. Their reputation for violence meant that detectives had long since labelled them as being far worse than the Krays. Meanwhile, other professionals in South London made themselves available to McAvoy and Robinson as the word of the big job spread through the upper echelons of the underworld. And amongst others circling were three members of the legendary 1963 Great Train Robbery gang, who were keen to invest some of their money in this new opportunity. Two of them even pressed to be on the actual robbery team because of their previous unique experience. One of them was Charlie Wilson, who had been credited with being one of the leaders of the GTR. He contacted McAvoy but was snubbed. McAvoy, to ensure that no one tipped off the police about the job in advance, told him that the job had been cancelled. Too many of McAvoy's criminal associates had been grassed up in recent times, and McAvoy believed that the fewer people knew about the job was still going ahead, it was the better. He could just about live with the rumours of the big job, but if the date of it never leaks out, the job would be doomed. Just going to quickly turn to the chat there. Hi there, just chilling. Thank you for joining us. Hello, Baywatcher. Good to see you. Okay. McAvoy and Robinson both believed that if they let any big names like the Great Train Robbers duo to join the raid, they would lose control of the job and the money would end up in the hands of the villains who weren't even the proper part of his gang. In the middle of all this, the legendary face called Georgie Boy Francis was forging close relationships with McAvoy and Robinson, embedded deep within the underworld with a string of convictions, theft and violence. Francis had risen to criminal prominence in the late 70s and became a part of a group of armed robbers who decided to move into drug trafficking. Specially converted containers were sent to a shoe factory in Pakistan, where millions of pounds worth of cannabis was hidden by legitimate goods and shipped back to the UK. The first 4 runs went like clockwork. Francis and other members of the gang began living the good life, buying cars, jewellery and making a show of lighting their cigars with £20 notes in South London pubs. But when the 5th drug consignment arrived, custom officers were watching. Lenny Teddy Bar Watkins, driving a lorry filled with £2.5 million worth of cannabis, spotted the surveillance team. And as soon as he realised that he'd been seen, custom investigator Peter Bennett moved in to make the arrest. Watkins shot dead Bennett. Watkins was sentenced to life, and the rest of the gang were put on trial. Underworld sources claim that Francis talked to associates about nobbling the jury to ensure he was not convicted. As it happened, the first jury failed to reach a verdict. This resulted in a retrial that led to his acquittal, while Francis walked free. Several other members of the gang faced with the same evidence and pleaded guilty. When McAvoy heard about the A-team's role in helping Francis escape justice, it was another impressive calling card on behalf of the North London crime family, even if he still viewed them with great suspicion. Because they were on the wrong side of the Thames, Francis was not only up for the big job, but also reiterated that McAvoy had already been told that the Adams family from North London would be the ideal people to launder the proceeds. Another character who came onto the scene at this stage was one of Mickey McAvoy's oldest mates, South East London robber Brian Perry. Perry had been recruited to be part of the Brinks-Mat robbery team itself alongside Robinson, McAvoy and Tony White. Perry would also eventually play a pivotal role in the organisation and the distribution of the proceeds afterwards. Perry, in his late 30s at the time, was a classic car southeast London villain with a successful minicab business, which was actually a money laundering siphon for the proceeds of the numerous crimes. Now, the robbery team would also be joined by John Little Legs Lloyd. He was an old school villain from across the river in the East End. He'd moved to Kent with his wife Jeannie and had long been accepted by the Southeast London criminal fraternity as one of their own. Lloyd was renowned as a hard-nosed blagger and a successful one at that. His name had been linked by the police to many of the most outrageous robberies in the 70s. He was just the sort of pro that McAvoy and Robinson needed on their team for the Brinks-Mat job. The A team, led by the debonair Terry Adams, introduced main players McAvoy and Robinson to a character called Brian the Milkman Wright. He wasn't going to get his hands dirty with any actual robbery, but he was also a renowned fixer with superb contacts. Wright and the Adams had known each other since childhood, as their parents were Irish immigrants from North London. His background presented a major problem for McAvoy and Robinson. They didn't fully trust anyone from outside their own manor, but they had to get over their prejudice, and after being read the Riot Act by the old-timer financer, the Fox, who believed the job could turn out to be bigger than anyone ever expected. He wanted the sort of expertise that would ensure no last-minute hitches, and it meant calling in help from the north of the river, then so be it. Now, the A-team brought along a very extrovert character on the big job who seemed to flit effortlessly back and forth across the Thames without even raising an eyebrow. Mickey Green. He was nicknamed the Pimpernel because of his extraordinary ability to avoid arrest. Green had his first cut. his criminal teeth into as a robber in a notorious gang from Wembley, northwest London, and this was in the late 1960s. But by the early 80s, he'd spread his wings far and wide and was well known to the underworlds of both London and southern Spain, as well as Southern Ireland. He was an expert of laundering large amounts of stolen cash and knew all the tricks of the trade. Over the coming years, he'd had a significant part to play in the Brinks-Mat story. Now, the big job that McAvoy and Robinson had dreamed of carrying out since they began thieving as teenagers was in danger of being taken over by a bunch of faces from the London Underworld before the planning for it had even been completed. McAvoy was struggling to retain control and leadership, and it made him short-tempered at just a time when he knew it was crucial to remain patient and wait for the perfect moment to raid the Brinks-Mat warehouse. Inside man Tony Black nervously told his brother-in-law Brian Robinson and Mick McAvoy that he'd overheard mention of a fucking huge quantity of money and gold that was imminently going to be stored overnight between flights to the United States. Now, Black revealed that the Brinks-Mat had stepped up security at the warehouse in recent weeks, presumably because of a larger than usual quantities of cash and gold that were coming in. He told Robinson about all the latest alarm and security systems in place in the building, and even drew a diagram of the entrance, corridors and the connecting doors. Robinson pressurised Black into making sure that he would inform them when an extra large consignment was on its way to the warehouse. Okay, right, I'm going to leave it there, folks. We're going to continue this on tomorrow. Okay, I'm just going to turn my camera on because I only think that it's right. I'm going to just quickly go through the comments in the chat. Brilliant. Baywatcher, thank you for coming. Hello there, just chilling. Paul, okay. I'm glad that you all came. Is there any questions? Does anyone want to ask me any questions regarding the topic that I've been going through? As I say now, I've been on just well over an hour now, and to obviously keep you all on board and keep you interested, I'm going to cut it there, and then I'm going to pick it back up. Let me just see who we got in the chat. Okay. Well, if there is no any questions, I'm going to say to you all, have an excellent Saturday, because I know a lot of you, it's probably getting to around tea time, and you've all probably got plans this evening. And I just really want to leave it there. So I will pick this up again, probably about same time tomorrow. If we say 4 p.m. Eastern time, 2 p.m. Pacific time, so that it'll be 9 o'clock tomorrow. So again, everyone, thank you for your time. I really appreciate that. As I say, please like and subscribe, share, and leave a comment. Thank you. God bless.